If you've ever counted your money twice in the same night, just to feel calm enough to sleep, this story is for you. There's a particular kind of fear that doesn't show up as fear at all. It shows up as responsibility, as discipline, as being careful. You call it planning ahead, being smart, staying safe. But underneath it, if you're honest, there's a tightness in your chest every time you think about what you have and whether it's enough. That tightness has a name, and it isn't caution. It's control. Not you controlling your money controlling you. Today I want to tell you about a cloth merchant who was the wealthiest man in his province, and also the most afraid. A monk asked him one question that he could not answer for 3 days. When the merchant finally understood the answer, he needed only 7 words to say it. Those 7 words changed how he touched his own money for the rest of his life. But those words won't mean anything to you yet. First, you have to understand what his wealth had already taken from him, long before that question was asked. Before we go on, tell me in the comments, what's the one number that, no matter how high it climbs, never actually makes you feel safe? You might be surprised how many people are typing the same answer right now. The merchant's name was Rashid, and he lived in a trading town where the river met the old caravan road, in a house with 3 courtyards and more rooms than he could remember the uses for. This was generations ago, in a time when wealth was counted in bolts of dyed silk, sacks of cardamom, and coins kept in clay jars buried beneath floorboards. Rashid had started with nothing but a donkey cart and a talent for knowing which fabric would sell before anyone else did. By the time he was 40, merchants from 3 regions asked his opinion before making their own trades. He was, by every visible measure, a man who had won. But Rashid had a habit nobody else knew about. Every night after his household was asleep, after the last servant's footsteps had faded down the hall and the courtyards had gone quiet enough to hear the river in the distance, he would light a single lamp, lock the door of his study, and count his coins. Not because he had lost track of them. He knew exactly how much he had, down to the last piece. He counted them because counting them was the only thing that let the knot in his stomach loosen, even briefly. Some nights it took an hour. Some nights it took until the lamp burned low and his eyes ached. He told himself this was diligence. A careful man checks his ledgers. But diligence does not make your hands shake when a jar feels lighter than you remembered. He had stopped eating at the market stalls with the other traders because spending on food that wasn't strictly necessary felt like a small betrayal of everything he'd built. He had stopped visiting his brother's family 2 towns over because the trip cost coin and time he could otherwise spend working. He told himself he was simply focused. Serious men do not waste afternoons on visits. But somewhere in the last several years, Rashid had traded every soft thing in his life. Meals shared, afternoons wasted on purpose, the particular uselessness of laughter with people who loved him, for the feeling of a heavier jar. And the jar never once made him feel finished. This is the part of Rashid you might recognize, even if your wealth is counted in a different currency. Maybe you've never buried coins under a floor, but maybe you've checked a banking app 4 times in one afternoon, not because you expected the number to change, but because seeing it gave you a flicker of relief that faded within minutes. Maybe you've turned down a dinner with someone you love because the cost felt irresponsible, while spending far more without a second thought on something that numbed you instead of connecting you. Rashid's jar is not so different from your app. The fear underneath is the same fear. One afternoon, a monk passed through the trading town on his way to the mountains, carrying nothing but a bowl and a single spare robe. He stopped at Rashid's stall, not to buy anything, but because he'd heard the merchant's name spoken with a strange mixture of admiration and pity by 2 women selling vegetables nearby. Rashid, curious about a man who owned so little and seemed to want for nothing, invited him to share tea. The monk accepted. He asked Rashid simple questions at first: how business was, how the harvest looked, how his family fared. Rashid answered easily, the way a man does when he's discussing anything except the thing that actually worries him. But then the monk set down his cup and asked a different kind of question, quietly, without any weight behind it at all. When you lie down tonight, whose hands will be holding your money? Yours or your fears? Rashid laughed, the way people laugh when a question lands somewhere they'd rather it hadn't. He gave a quick answer about prudence and hard work. The monk simply nodded and thanked him for the tea and left the way he'd come, offering no argument, no correction. He didn't need to. The question stayed. But what Rashid didn't know was that the question would follow him home that very night, sit beside him while he counted his coins, and refuse to leave. For the first night, Rashid counted as usual and told himself the monk's words were nothing, the idle riddle of a man who had nothing to lose and so could afford to speak lightly of what others had built. But his count came out wrong twice, and he had to start over both times, which had never happened before. On the second night, he didn't bother counting at all. He simply sat with the jar in his lap, unopened, and tried to answer the monk's question honestly. Whose hands? He thought of the family visit he'd canceled. He thought of the meals he'd skipped at the stalls where the other traders laughed together over spiced lentils. He thought of how long it had been since he'd done anything with an afternoon except protect it. And this is where everything began to shift, though Rashid didn't recognize it yet. He noticed, for the first time, that he could not remember what he had originally wanted the money for. There had been a reason once. A house that didn't leak in the monsoon. A daughter's wedding paid without debt. Security so that fear could finally sit down. But somewhere along the way, the money had stopped serving that original want and had simply become the thing he served instead. The goal had quietly become the master. Remember this detail, because it matters later. Rashid still had every coin he had ever earned. Nothing had been lost, and yet he felt for the first time in years that he had less than nothing, because none of it had ever once made the fear go away. It had only ever bought him a few hours of quiet before the fear returned, hungrier. On the third night, Rashid did something he hadn't done in a decade. He left the jar closed, walked out of his study, out of his gate, and through the dark streets to the small room above a tea shop where he knew travelers sometimes stayed. The monk was still there, sitting on the floor with his bowl beside him, awake, as though he had been expecting the visit. Rashid sat across from him and admitted, for the first time out loud, that he did not know the answer to the question. He admitted the counting. He admitted the canceled visits. He admitted that despite 3 courtyards and jars of coin under his floor, he had not felt safe, truly safe, in longer than he could remember. He asked the monk, almost desperately, what he was supposed to do. Give it all away, live with a bowl, own nothing? The monk was quiet for a long moment. Then he said the 7 words that Rashid would carry for the rest of his life. You already own everything you fear losing. Rashid sat with that sentence the way you sit with something too large to hold all at once. He asked the monk to explain, but the monk only shook his head gently and said that explaining it would turn it back into an idea, and Rashid needed to feel it, not understand it. So Rashid asked instead what he should do about the coins, the jars, the counting. The monk answered with a question of his own. He asked Rashid to imagine, honestly, the very worst thing that could happen. Every jar emptied, every coin gone, the courtyard sold, the business collapsed entirely. And then he asked, in that imagined ruin, is there a single person who loves you now who would stop loving you then? Rashid said no. The monk asked, would the ability to feel the sun on your face in the morning disappear along with the coins? Rashid said no. The monk asked, would the part of you that knows how to build something from nothing, the very thing that built this wealth in the first place, would that vanish too? Rashid quietly said no. Then everything you actually fear losing, the monk said, was never in the jar. It never left your hands because your hands were never what held it. This is the turning point, and it is worth sitting with. Rashid had spent years protecting a jar, believing the jar was the thing keeping his life safe. But the coins were never the source of his safety. They were, at most, a tool that occasionally made safety easier to arrange. The actual safety, the people who loved him, his own capability, his health, the plain fact of another sunrise, had been his all along, untouched by any of his counting. He had been standing guard over the wrong treasure, and in doing so, had let the real one go unvisited for years. Here is what that merchant's fear looks like in your life, whether or not you've ever owned a single coin of your own. That merchant is you every time you refresh a banking app hoping the number will finally deliver the feeling of enough, and it doesn't, and you refresh it again anyway. He is you when you decline the dinner, the trip, the quiet, unnecessary pleasure, not because you truly cannot afford it, but because spending on anything that isn't survival feels like carelessness. He is you when your sense of worth rises and falls with a number that has nothing to do with whether you were kind today, or present, or alive to your own life. He is you when you say yes to another late night of extra work you don't need, because stopping feels more dangerous than exhaustion. He is you when a friend asks how you're doing and the honest answer is tired and afraid, but what comes out instead is fine, busy, just being careful with money right now. Money in itself is neutral. It is paper or metal or now mostly numbers on a screen, and it has never once cared about you. The danger was never the money. The danger is attachment, the belief, usually unspoken, that a number can do the emotional work of making you safe, when what you're actually hungry for is something money was never built to provide. Attachment turns a useful tool into a jailer because you begin obeying it instead of using it. This is the one idea to take from Rashid's story, and it deserves to stand alone without being crowded by 10 other lessons. The fear does not live in your accounts. It lives in what you've decided your accounts mean about you. So how do you loosen a grip you didn't fully know you had? Not by giving everything away in a dramatic gesture. That would only be attachment wearing a different costume. Rashid didn't sell his business or empty his jars. He simply changed his relationship to them in small, deliberate ways. Starting that same week. The first thing he did was choose one evening a week where he would not check a single ledger, not out of neglect, but as a practice, proof to himself that his worth did not evaporate the moment he stopped watching the number. Tonight, before you sleep, try the same thing. Close the app. Notice that you are still entirely yourself without it open. The second thing he did was spend, on purpose, on something that bought connection, rather than protection. He visited his brother's family the following week, paying for nothing more than the trip itself, and returned lighter than any night of counting had ever left him. Choose one small, specific expense this week that buys you time with someone you love, and notice how differently that spending feels in your chest compared to spending born from fear. The third thing he did was write down, on a scrap of paper he kept folded in his robe, 3 things he owned that no jar could ever hold and no ruin could ever take. His daughter's laugh. The particular steadiness of his own hands at the loom. The sunrise over the river road he'd walked every morning for 20 years and never once truly looked at. Tonight, do the same. Write down 3 things money cannot buy that are already completely yours. These 3 things: the evening unwatched, the spending that connects rather than protects, the list of what fear cannot touch, are small. They will not feel dramatic, but they are how a grip loosens, one evening, one visit, one honest list at a time. Fear does not release its hold because you argue with it. It releases its hold because you keep proving gently and repeatedly that you are still standing without it. Picture Rashid many years later, an old man now, sitting in his courtyard as the sun goes down, a bowl of tea cooling in his hands rather than a jar of coins in his lap. He still worked, still traded, still built things. The story was never that wealth is wrong, but he no longer counted in the dark. He no longer needed the weight of the jar to tell him he was safe, because he had finally located where his safety actually lived, and it had never been buried under any floorboard. In his own words, spoken to his grandchildren decades later, he would say it simply: I spent half my life guarding a jar and the other half realizing the jar was never what I was afraid of losing. And the truth underneath his story is this: you are not chasing a number. You are chasing the feeling you believe that number will finally deliver. But that feeling was never for sale, and it was never missing. It has been waiting, quietly, in the parts of your life no account balance has ever touched. If this story gave you even one moment of that quiet, there are more waiting for you here. Next time, I'll tell you about a debt collector who spent 30 years chasing what others owed him, until the day someone he had never met forgave a debt he didn't even know he owed. Walk gently, hold loosely,